I'm Michael Bain, and this is The Best Defense, our special roundtable every week during the duration of the COVID-19 emergency. And of course, joining me today is Michael Janich, Mike Seeklander, Dr. William April, and probably Rob Pincus will be joining us as soon as he gets to a live telephone. And this is our 6th week, and in this last week, I've got emails from people who said, it's time for you guys to address the elephant in the room. And I think we pretty much all know what that elephant is, but if you recall last week, Dr. William April began by talking about moving the goalpost in terms of what we were trying to accomplish with this lockdown. Now, that was the first time I'd heard that. If you search moving the goalpost / COVID-19, right now you're going to get more than 100,000 hits. Dr. April, it would appear you were about a week ahead of the curve, but it seems to me the goalpost may well be moving. Could you explain that, what we were trying to do, and now how that goalpost is moving around?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, you'd like to be able to take the suggestions from CDC and other high-level sources at face value, but some pretty basic terms are not really being defined terribly well. You know, like we talked about last week, flattening the curve doesn't necessarily mean lowering the raw number of cases. It means spreading them out over a larger unit of time so as to keep services from being overwhelmed. Well, and now you're getting people who say we need to contemplate reopening states and cities when there are no more cases. Well, that in itself begs question of definition. Do you mean a flat level of increase, or do you mean no new cases? Because if we're waiting until there are no new cases in a jurisdiction, we may very well be waiting forever. So I think this really cries out for some thought so that we can know what we're shooting for.
Mr. Janich, could you elaborate on that a little bit? And then one of the things that we talked about so much in the Best Defense and Best Defense Survival was the concept that you're on your own. And now I sort of see people saying, well, we have to stay indoors till there are no more cases, which, considering that viruses are predators that hunt us, and they're so very good at it, it seems to me that a lot of people have kind of missed the meaning of you're on your own.
I think they have. You know, when you look at the protests that have been happening as far as, hey, we need to get everything back on track, you have all the controversy over, we need to reopen things, and, it's not really as bad as we thought, and all that kind of stuff. Again, as we've talked about before in previous weeks here, everybody is in an individual situation. And most importantly, that individuality is based on your risk factors as far as contracting the disease. If you were to get it, how survivable would it be, or would you be, if you contract the disease? So if you do have pre-existing conditions, if you have any kind of respiratory issues, all the things that we've talked about before, those are the things where you need to look at it and say, okay, I'm at high risk and I need to be extra careful. Just like when we talk about self-defense, if you have limited physical attributes, and you say, you know what, I can't run away from an attacker and I don't have the physicality to fight back. So I need to resort to weapons, and better yet, I need to be extremely avoidant and not go out that much. It's the same type of thing. Trying to avoid the situation is always going to be your best bet, especially if you have limited resources and limited attributes to work with.
Mr. Seeklander, it almost seems that the problem with all this information that seems to be so fluid, what was true yesterday isn't true today, and it probably won't be true tomorrow. It's almost making it impossible for you as an individual to calculate your own risk.
I think it is very difficult to calculate risk in terms of this thing, especially when we're talking like in my community, we've been on mayor and governor mandated lockdown to an extent, or at least from a business standpoint. That doesn't mean they're stopping cars and stopping people or ticketing people that are, for example, filming content. I went to an MMA gym the other day and I filmed some content with a buddy of mine where I heard online about another high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor doing the same thing with maybe a 2-person camera crew, and he got ticketed, which is, to me, is ridiculous. But it's still kind of an unseen threat unless you've been affected by it. But the interesting shift that I'm seeing, and kind of feeling is business owners and individuals that haven't touched or felt this thing, that haven't been sick, that haven't lost a loved one, that are literally about to lose everything they've worked for, now decided, okay, what am I actually fighting? Am I fighting this virus? Am I fighting hunger? Or am I fighting the fact that I'm about to lose the business that I worked 20 years to build? Which is interesting. I just think there's a shift in focus right now. And I think it's harder and harder for the government to say, hey, our best bet is to do this when people still can't really see it. I mean, I see people in masks, but I haven't seen anybody sick. None of my family's sick. We're not, and I'm not, playing the Mr. Positive here. I certainly believe in it. I mean, I clean things, and we go to the grocery store. We're still disinfecting everything. We're following the exact same protocol, and maybe that's why none of us have gotten sick. But I think it's a weird time right now.
I saw a set of a statistical model, and once again, I mean, we all know what statistical models are. They're inherently flawed. But this specific statistical model was on, for every 1% percentage increase in unemployment, that led to an X percentage increase in suicides and a Y percentage increase in opioid addiction. And essentially what the scientists who created the model said is at 20% unemployment, you just bought 77,000 more dead people in the course of 12 months from suicide and addiction. And her argument was, dead is dead. You saved 60,000 people from the virus. You killed 77,000 on this end. Dr. April, I mean, you've been talking about this now since the beginning, that this is a danger that oftentimes we don't even see.
No, well, that data point has come in, actually bridging the gap between that sort of theoretical model and the facticity of the circumstance. Last week in the state of Tennessee, more people died of suicide than died of coronavirus. And Tennessee is a very interesting state because it's rural, and of course intensely urban in spots. But so that means across a broad section of people, you're getting the secondary effects of the lockdown becoming more lethal than the virus that we're locking down from. So when it crosses from theoretical to real, then I think we've got a whole different conversation to be had.
And I think we've kind of come up on that. In one of my other lives, which you guys know, I spent a lot of time on risk management and risk mitigation. One of the big business magazines in the country once called me the Lord High God of risk management. And my whole philosophy, my structure of risk management that I consulted on was understanding risk. And risk is, it's actual versus perceived. And then once you get actual risk, it's subjective versus objective. Subjective risk is risk you can actually have some control over. And then objective risk is God points at you and says, you're it. And there's really not much you can do there. But the key to risk mitigation, at least in as the way I understand it, and certainly the way I taught it, was a knowledge of facts. That you had to have real data in order to mitigate a risk. And scrolling through the internet today and reading a bunch of stuff, I started like making points of data that's fluid, that is not confirmed, that changes, and I stopped when I got to 10. It seems like essentially everything knowledge associated with this virus comes with a caveat that, well, this actually may not be true. This might not be correct. These might not be the main numbers. Which again makes an individual trying to mitigate risk, Mr. Janet, just as a thing to follow up on something you said, comorbidity factors. What's the number one? I read one article that said unconditionally it's hypertension. I read a second article that said it's unconditionally diabetes. Which is it? Probably both.
And those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So that's part of it as well. You have that dynamic where people who have, one physical malady or condition or something like that, it's often associated with something else. When you look at people who are diabetic, in many cases you also have, an element of being overweight. With being overweight, you have the element of hypertension. So it becomes a cascading effect. So again, it depends, like you say, how you collect that data and how you isolate that data, because It's like, okay, well, this person has hypertension. Great. So they fall into that category. Statistically, they're included in a particular subset, but the other elements that actually made them more vulnerable on top of that might be diabetes, might be something else. So it's not exclusive where you say, okay, well, other than hypertension, I don't really have any other issue. It's not that clear cut. It never is, because we're all dynamic individuals. We have all these different elements that make up who we are and what our vulnerabilities are.
I see that Mr. Pincus, Rob Pincus, has joined us. Rob, to bring you up to speed, we're talking about the challenges for individuals in figuring their own risk factors. And of course, there you go. So we're talking about challenges for individuals in trying to figure out their personal risk factors as they start going back outside, going back to work, going back into the world. I know you've had a lot of thoughts on that. You've been posting a lot of thoughts on that. What are the risks? How do we ameliorate them?
Well, as you guys are obviously talking about, there are the general risks, and then there's very personal risks. And guess what? This is a lot like what we talk about when it comes to risk assessment, when it comes to general personal defense, right? You have to know like what your strengths and weaknesses are. A few weeks ago, I published a series of articles I wrote, 7 or 8 years ago on comprehensive approaches to personal defense and safety and security. And it starts with, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And what are the real threats in your area? So when we look at it very specifically, I'm especially interested right now in people who are going back to work and people who are going to be reopening their businesses. And I've been spending a lot of time talking to a variety of different people, from medical experts to, disaster management to business owners, especially to a lot of workers and business owners that have been open, and not big chain stores and like that, which have done a pretty good job of instituting procedures and policies. But how are these smaller stores that have been designated essential and haven't been shut down dealing with it? How are the smaller shops dealing with it? Because there's issues of reduced capacity, there's cleanliness issues, there's reduced hours, maybe taking a break in the middle of the day to sanitize the place, closing for an hour or two, strict policies for employees. So the risk factors for the business owner, for the employees also are very specialized and very unique. And some businesses are looking around and saying, I can't afford to open if I can only be at 1/3 capacity. Well, you may not be able to afford to open. Some people are looking around and saying, if my state reopens and my state opens businesses back up, that doesn't mean I feel comfortable. There's an emotional, mental health aspect of this. You don't feel safe. And then there's the practical, I'm going to go back to work. I'm going to go out. How do I stay as safe as possible? Obviously, I was running a little late today. I apologize. I got my time zones goofed up. I was wearing my mask. I just came out of a store 10 minutes ago and used the hand sanitizer, the alcohol, 65, 70% hand sanitizer when I got back into the truck. I actually left all the stuff in the truck. When I bring it in, I'll do the same thing. I'll wipe it down. The cashier was using gloves behind a plexiglass shield. People know what their health issues are, their underlying health issues for the most part. I've said in the past week, I've gone on record, I'm going to get the virus. I just made up a number, 77% chance I'm going to get it. I kind of feel like I'm surprised I haven't gotten it yet. I don't believe is what I keep saying. I don't know of any underlying mitigating exacerbating health issues. Maybe I'm going to find out I have one when and if I get struck with it. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that. It's a realistic concern, but I don't think it should paralyze us.
Mike Seeklander, have you started thinking of a list that we could give people to say, okay, you're getting ready to go back into the world. What would be on your list to tell people to say, before you step out your front door and you make this commitment to go back in the world, back to work, back to living a semi-normal life, what do you think would be on that risk list?
The risk, that's a great question. I think, once again, this whole thing, call it a virus on training wheels or pandemic on training wheels, I think we've already learned what's on the list. I think we already know to an extent. I also agree with what Rob said and some of the experts. This thing is, I think the doctor talked about endemic. Maybe that's not the proper word, but a lot of us are going to get this. This is never, ever going to go away. It's going to cycle the planet. and there's a very good chance a lot of us are going to get this, but I think we already know what is on that list. I think we understand now social contact and how that's changed. I'm absolutely amazed at how people or humans have changed their habits. And I don't know, I think I said this on the last roundtable, but as I watch TV shows now, in previous times that, people acted normal. They were filmed in a coffee shop or a restaurant, they're doing things and they're hugging and shaking hands. And in my mind, I'm going, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're shaking hands and hugging. They're not, it's so weird. It's already imprinted on me. But, I think it's the standard. I think it's the standard things that unfortunately we all know right now. And of course, beyond that should be all of the regular stuff, avoidance, awareness, self-defense planning. None of that stuff changed, based on this virus. I still find it weird from a social standpoint that I can't really read people's body language as much as I could. I can't see their facial expressions. I can't see if the angry eyes are actually angry eyes, or if that's just the kind of eyes the person has and they're maybe smiling or they have whatever. I don't know. I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And one thing, on the elephant in the room, they're supposedly opening up in the state of Oklahoma. At the state level, they're saying, yes, May 1st. And this Friday, they're opening up hair salons and stuff like that. Now, of course, this also rolls to the mayors. So what I'm hearing is the governor said, yeah, we're going to do this, but now each individual mayor can make decisions, which is kind of weird because let's say you have a small place with a bunch of businesses and a mom and pop business that doesn't want to lose what they've worked for 15 years, but their mayor in that town says, no, we're not going to open up. Well, what happens when this business opens up? I just find it really weird or interesting how they're going to actually enforce that. When people say, piss off, I'm going to open my small restaurant up, and guess what? I've got a 12 gauge, so send the sheriff if you want to, but we're going to have a confrontation. I don't know. Just, once again, interesting. So I know I veered off track a little bit. Sorry about this.
Oh, no. I kind of agree with you. I watched an episode of Last Man Standing, and they were hugging and touching and shaking hands and everything. It was like watching Downton Abbey. It's like, look what those people used to do. Dr. April, you're in one of the epicenters. So you're a little different than us. We're in Colorado and in Oklahoma. We're in states that have clearly flatted out and are declining. So I don't know what the situation is in Louisiana, specifically in New Orleans, but you're still in a hot zone, if you will. How has that changed for you?
Well, even recently, over the past week, we've had some pronounced flattening out. It took us 3 days to get to change the hundreds column in the total, and that's an extraordinary decline from the past month or so when it's been going up several hundred cases a day. So there are hopeful signs. We're a small city with a pretty high population density, and we're a pretty social bunch, and so social distancing has been a bit of a challenge for us, but it does seem to be working. But one thing I want to address is that people are responding to these, circumstances where the states and cities can open up, unquote, as if they were an order to go out and socialize. If you feel like your risk is high, you can stay quarantined as long as you'd like. And so your own personal risk assessment should trump anything from a state or municipality, in my mind. There's no order that you go out and circulate. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Mr. Judge, how often do we talk about your own personal risk assessment over the last 14 years? On a pretty regular basis.
One of the interesting things, I was talking with a friend of mine who's very knowledgeable about this stuff, very involved as far as preparedness, and actually works in an official capacity in that regard. And one of the things that he is paying a lot of attention to is what's going on in Sweden right now. So when you look at Sweden, essentially everybody else in Europe had the lockdown. They all decided, you know what, we're going to do exactly the same stuff we're doing here. We're going to quarantine people. We're going to do the stay-at-home order and all that kind of stuff. And essentially the epidemiologist who is in charge in Sweden said, you know what, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to allow people to go out. We're going to let people essentially do all the stuff that we're kind of looking at, talking about the elephant in the room. What's going to be coming up very soon for most places here is that ability to go out and kind of resume a normal lifestyle. And essentially what Sweden did was they said, we want to approach herd immunity. So herd immunity is essentially where you have the community spread of the disease. You kind of let nature take its course. And essentially, when you hit about a 60% immunity rate based on exposure, natural exposure to the disease, that's about the same rate that you would normally get as far as immunity with an organized inoculation program if there was, a vaccine. And essentially what it did, obviously, was it accelerated the process rather than flattening the curve. But they're basically saying that about 20%, I think right now, are considered to have been exposed to the disease and are already immune, and they're expecting to hit that 60% within a few weeks. What they're saying is, first of all, the responsibility is with the individual. So they essentially said, you know what, everyone has to do the responsible thing as far as their individual situation. And what they're saying is, if you are at risk, if you fall into a vulnerable category, then yeah, stay at home, do the smart thing. If you don't fall into that category, then understand what risks you're taking. If you happen to be sick and you display symptoms, then stay the hell away from everybody else. And essentially, they're applying a lot of logic and common sense to the situation, but they're doing it in a way that is very different from what everybody else is doing. They're still experiencing a high mortality rate, but it's a mortality rate among the people who are at most at risk anyway. So it's really interesting to see that. And I think, when we talk about modeling and all that type of thing, looking at what's going on there, I think that could be a great predictive kind of indicator of what we're going to see as things open up, because they're already doing it, and they've done it all along.
Okay, we were getting a little feed through there from somewhere. I think so.
It wasn't me.
I'm not sure what. I'm sure it was you. You can't fool us, Janet.
I'm sitting in a copper cage. The entire place is a big Faraday cage. So
we should probably say that to the people who are watching, that all of us live in Faraday cages because we're waiting for the EMP. Mr. Pincus, if you're there, or I'm sorry, Dr. April, you needed to speak for a second there.
It's also interesting lately that we're getting some better illuminated peaks at the bottom of the fraction, at the denominator involved. I mean, there was a study actually from 2 sites in California last week that showed antibody presence, meaning that people have been exposed, in 50 times and 85 times the number of current acknowledged cases. So it seems that the bottom of the fraction is much, much larger than previously thought, and that means the mortality rate and the serious incidence rate are much, much lower than have been anticipated by many of the models. And I think that's an interesting and favorable sign. More and more people are getting it and basically not suffering effects that require hospitalization. That's certainly the most hopeful sign in the last week for me.
Well, where you saw that probably the first coronavirus death in the United States was at least a month and maybe earlier than we thought, because the virus itself is here. Through Chinese indifference or communist China just being communist China, the virus came pretty quickly. Rob, I know you've written at this point on a regular basis on exactly this, that if that denominator gets bigger and bigger and bigger, then in a sense, the virus gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
It does. The more people that it turns out have been exposed, as we get these antibody tests online, we're going to find out, I think, and again, this isn't Rob just making stuff up while I'm driving around and flying around the country, talking to a lot of experts, talking to a lot of physicians, including those in hot spots. Everything is trending towards what Dr. April just said, that we're going to find out that denominator. We're never really going to know what that is, but we're not going to have 100% testing. But we're seeing in samples from Germany to California where more and more it's indicating that this is not as high a serious hospitalization rate or certainly mortality rate as the worst case scenario projections. Now, part of that is physical distancing, using the PPE, and doing all the things we've done. Sweden is really interesting to me. A lot of people will point out, well, Sweden has a higher percentage or per capita mortality and infection rate than neighboring Finland and Norway. Well, of course they do, because of their approach. What they don't have is a cataclysmic rate, What they don't have are these predictions of, well, if you allow people to do, what they think is best based on the information we have, then you're opening up Pandora's box, and you're going to see skyrocketing, overwhelming the medical system, and it's not. We're not seeing that there. I think the big difference, you have to remember, the outbreaks that we saw in New York, the outbreaks in Louisiana, a lot of this happened long before the vast majority of the population really had the proper behavior or the best case, best practices in mind. We had everybody from our leadership to the guy at the coffee shop saying this was no big deal. It wasn't going to affect us like it was affecting China, until the middle of March in most communities in the U.S. So I think it's really important to factor in. I posted this morning, we have to watch Georgia. Georgia is our Sweden, I guess, at this point. Now, and Colorado is going to open up. There are other places that are opening up, but Georgia is the one that's being watched the closest because they're opening up the fastest, and starting tomorrow. We have to watch two things. We have to watch the human behavior. Are people going to wear masks? Are people going to not go? Are businesses going to decide not to open? Bowling alleys. Everybody's making a big deal about bowling alleys. Are they essential or aren't they? Well, I want to know how the bowling alley is going to open up. Are they going to put hand sanitizer at all the ball returns? Is the staff going to be wearing masks, and then they're only going to open every third lane? Or are they going to go free for all and just say, hey, we can open, so we're opening, and it's on you guys to figure it out? I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that. The second thing, obviously, we have to watch is the increase, and there will be. There's probably going to be a slight, if we did nothing, there'd still be an increase in Georgia anyway. Atlanta, by the way, hasn't been hit severely. The biggest outbreak place in Georgia right now is still Albany. It's not the biggest city in Georgia yet. That's not a spike. So I think we're going to see increases. The question is, 10 to 15 days after things open up, will we then see this hockey stick kind of huge increase that indicates mistakes were made? They're the experiments. Science is about, you do an experiment and you observe the results. Georgia's our experiment right now.
Well, I think it's good to point that out. I thought it was interesting that the mayor of Las Vegas offered the entire city of Las Vegas as a control. She said, let us open up. We're the control. Of course, I think it's tragic what happened in New York. I lived in New York, and I do have a relationship with New York, a lot of friends there. But the entire time I lived in New York and I rode the subway to work, we were sick all winter because we were on top of each other. Everybody got everything when you rode the train. I'm sure it was the same the situation with Mardi Gras in New Orleans, or I've been to Chinatown in New York City for the Chinese New Year, where you're basically standing on top of each other, where you've had those large gatherings that predated the rise of the virus. I think it's fair to say, don't you guys, that we're going to see an increased number of cases when we open up, because that's what viruses do. But I think Rob maybe tagged that. Dr. April?
Well, there are times when we're best thought of as one nation, and there are times when we're best thought of as 50 states. And I think it's going to, the notion that we can apply a solution based on New York to Montana, let's say, is a little bit ridiculous. There was an article that came out yesterday and got a fair amount of traction. And the headline was, if half the COVID deaths in the country were in Montana, would the city of New York shut down? And the answer is no. And so local solutions are going to best address local problems. And so the notion that one size fits all and that the federal size is going to be it, I think it's one that appeals to some people but isn't terribly realistic to the rest of us.
Well, it's because we've created a culture where, or at least prior to COVID, where we were trying to make all things equal for everybody, equality of results as well as equality of opportunity. And in this particular situation, one size doesn't even come close to fitting all. Mr. Seeklander?
No, I agree. I think that, we always say it in terms of students that they don't know what they don't know. But we as a nation and a planet, I don't think, we still don't know what we don't know. It's weird how we've been doing these roundtables and how dramatically our opinions and thoughts have changed about certain things. And, if you would have predicted this one on the first one, my mentality has shifted. I think that we can overthink this deal. Like, although face masks and this virus is, obviously highly contagious and it's highly lethal, it's much more lethal than flu. Once again, a lot of things we already knew. Like, during flu season, there's a really bad flu season this year, right? If there was, what's everybody telling everybody to, hey, wash your hands. We do those things. We understand those things. And once again, I don't think we can control this, and because we still don't know what we don't know. And I totally agree with what Rob said. Once these states start to reopen, we're going to see a spike. We have to see a spike. I can't imagine a mathematical formula where that wouldn't occur. But the question is, how much of a spike is it going to be? How's it going to react? Are we going to see this thing tank our medical system? That was the problem in the first place, is, hey, we need to segregate and isolate and be in our homes because we don't want it to tank our medical system to the point where we can't treat someone. Because if we could put them on a ventilator, we could probably save their lives in a lot of cases. Well, if we don't have enough ventilators, that's the game, or that was the game. I'm also very interested to see where the actual numbers are in the end of this, where when it came to the country, how many people have actually already had it? Because that number seems to vary wildly as well. We don't know right now.
Let me just give you a quick, this is just a quick list of what we don't know. We don't know the prevalence of it in the population before it was first caught. We don't know the transmission rate, how it's really transmitted. We don't know the R0, how infectious it is. We don't know the R1, which is in fact real world data on who it's infected. We don't really have any idea of how it's being passed. We're still arguing over exactly, is it aerosol? Is it droplets? Can you touch it? Can you get it from here? Gosh, we don't understand the mechanism and the circumstances that it kills people. Why does it cause this cytokine storm in some young people? And at the same time in others, it shows literally no symptoms. We don't truly know the mortality rate of it because of the denominator issue. We're not totally sure about the immunity, the antibodies. Are you immune? If so, for how long? And it goes on and on. We said in terms of vaccines, there's a dozen vaccine things going on right now with no guarantee of a vaccine. As we said last week, look at the common cold. Flu vaccine's effective 50% of the time, and they've been working on the flu vaccine a long time. And the treatments themselves, there's contradictory things on the treatment, and God knows what to say about the models. The models are changing on an hourly basis. Literally, the primary model that's being operated out of Washington State is being updated every 12 hours, which is kind of like it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. That's a lot of you don't know what you don't know. Dr. April?
Well, and in that context, it's ripe to breed nuttiness, for lack of a better term. There's so much information, and it's so broadly spread that confirmation bias is easy to find. And so it's even more incumbent on the regular person out there to edit what they know, to be very careful about what information you take into your head and what information you believe, and also what information you disseminate. There's, things run rampant so quickly, and then you'll find out 12 hours later that was a misinterpretation, or that the article wasn't from a reputable source. And so we've got to be careful to avoid panic very deliberately. There's some people follow the 3-day rule about commenting on some national stories. I don't think that's a bad idea to put a speed bump in there to calm down about what you hear and how much of it you believe.
One thing that has remained consistent on all these roundtables is that on the very first roundtable, we said the media was driving panic. Well, 6 weeks later, it at least would be my interpretation that the media is driving panic. Mr. Janich?
I agree completely. I mean, it's one of these things where when you look at the media, again, that becomes a very, very personal thing as well. Some people get their news from Facebook and from social media and stuff like that, and that whole aspect of things has gotten incredibly weird. Even when you look at mainstream stuff, if you watch the evening news or whatever it might be, you have to take that with a grain of salt because they're putting their own spin on it. There's so many political agendas, there's so much other stuff that influences all that. One of the things that I did was start looking for, what are the most accurate sources of information you could find. What are the most reputable and everything? So like the Johns Hopkins website, they have a COVID-19 tracker on there. When you go to that, you can literally go and get down to your exact county, and it shows you just real statistics in raw numbers as far as what's going on in your county. You can compare that to counties around you, and that type of thing I find to be, I think, very sobering, because you look at it and you say, okay, cool, these are real statistics. These are things that I can kind of wrap my head around. I can look at and say, okay, let me assess what's going on. One of the things that has been talked about, and some people kind of shy away from it because of political correctness and everything, is susceptibility of minorities to being affected by COVID-19. So that's one of those things where you can look at it and say, well, yeah, minorities are more or less susceptible to it or whatever. Again, when you look at it at a more granular level and you say, okay, I'm going to look at Boulder County, Colorado, and see what the COVID-19 cases are. One of the things you need to take into consideration there is, what is the ethnic composition of Boulder, Colorado? It's going to be primarily white people. So when you look at the number of ethnic minorities that you would have, and if you see that, okay, across the board, what you got here is the number of cases reflects the basic ethnic composition of the population, okay, that makes sense. So when you hear something that seems way out of whack, you got to put it back into context. And you can't take something, again, just like, we're talking about New York City. New York City is a specific circumstance that is way different than Montana. It's way different than Colorado. It's way different from Georgia. You just have all these different variables. And when you try to, again, take a one-size-fits-all thing where you say, I'm going to watch the evening news and figure out what's going on, you won't, because you simply don't have enough information that is specific to a circumstance that might affect you. So we're back to the concept of you're on your own, which means think for yourself.
We keep coming back to that. On the matter of racial disparity in who the virus attacks, if you are in fact a person of color, a person of another ethnicity, that's a piece of information you really need to know when you're figuring out your own personal risk assessment there. Rob, where are you getting your information? Other than making it up, which I do know you do there. But,
yeah, other than just making things up wildly. Again, I'm talking to a lot of people on the ground and involved in this fight, from federal agencies, local agencies, disaster management, city council, people advising county commissioners, things like that. So I'm really trying to get a picture of what's happening on the ground. I scan all the major news channels. It's funny. I've always, and for decades now, since college, I read The Economist. I think The Economist gives a really, as neutral as you're going to find for a mainstream publication presentation of international news. And I also like their perspective of what's going on in America, just as a, sort of more neutral. Sure, it's left-leaning, but it's a more neutral than the agenda of a lot of the U.S.-based news sources. And they've been pretty spot on. I even highlighted an article that came out in the April 11th to the 17th, so 2 weeks ago issue, where they predicted the possibility, and in fact really leaned towards likely, that oil prices were going to go upside down, for example, because people are literally going to be paying people to hold their oil for them, because there wasn't going to be a place to put it if we didn't reopen the airlines and get economies moving again. Not that they were lobbying for that. They were just warning, hey, this is what's going to happen. So I try to really have a diverse input. What I think is a great exercise that I try to go through, and that I advise a lot of people, especially on the instructor development side, try to help people figure out how to be more objective and be critical thinkers, and really test their own integrity when it comes to principles for decisions they're going to make, and not, Dr. April mentioned confirmation bias. It's real easy. There's so much information out there. And especially if you go back over the last 2 months, the masks thing or the face covers thing, it comes up constantly. It's like, you can go find an expert that says don't wear them. You can find an expert that says wear them. You can find an expert that says they're vital. You can find experts in resources that say they don't do any good, if you're looking for it. If you look at the current information, if you look at information that's come out in the last week, and or research, real research that's been cited on the transmission of viruses and flu-like viruses and flu-like illnesses, it's really hard not to find some level of, yeah, I may as well wear the mask. You're really hard pressed, if you're looking for it, to not come up with words like may, words like probably, words like in this study or according to research. Like when you start seeing those phrases, you have to put those qualifications into whatever the summary statement is. So when someone says, well, as little as 1% effective, what I think you also need to hear is it's not zero, right? I heard somebody in the gun world the other day said, well, wearing a mask is, at this point, if you're not wearing a true respirator, if you're just wearing a face cover or a bandana, you may as well be carrying your gun without a round in the chamber. Carrying a gun without a round in the chamber, last time I thought about it, was better than not carrying a gun, right? You know, so I think that we need to be objective. So a really good exercise is this. If you believe masks are no good, go find a source or three that says masks are worth wearing. And now consider those sources and consider the arguments. It's like the old debate class thing, you know, that they don't do anymore in school, but where two people have to, you know, it's one topic and you just go up and you pick out of a bag. Are you for or against? You know, if you're for abortion, but you have to argue against abortion, that's a brilliant intellectual exercise in objectivity and critical thinking and in public discourse. You know, if you're for gun rights, but you have to make the arguments against gun access without mandated training, that's a brilliant intellectual exercise. And I think this is a great time for people to practice it because there's so much diversity in opinion from credentialed people and from resources that people normally trust. So try that thought experiment, you know, do the research against the position you believe right now and see if you're compelled to think about changing your mind.
Dr. April, how are you sorting and sifting information? Because I know you have a lot coming in from your contacts.
Yeah, it's I think critically important right now to maintain an open mind. You know, I try never to be shocked or disappointed that something comes out that disconfirms something that I would prefer to believe. One of the, you know, interesting things about that in the self-defense community is that I think a great many people at least take the position that they were sort of looking forward to a little bit of a boogaloo, so to speak, you know, criminal zombies marching down the street and, you know, blood running in the gutters, and that just hasn't taken place. In most places of the country, you know, crime is significantly down. But we have had an interesting spike here lately in a very specific crime. We've had 3 police officers shot in the line of duty in the past week. And that's well over a year's worth for us. And so that, to me, is something that bears watching, because what you're starting to get is a tendency among criminals to get more violent more quickly in their interactions with the police. And you can't help but wonder, how much does the general atmosphere of crisis play into that? Does the general retreat from normal policing standards play into that? And so looking for effects that occur, I think, is our task, rather than looking for effects that we would prefer to see.
I think in my old risk management days, we talked about that as Hume's guillotine. What David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, 18th century, if you say what something is, you're describing a natural situation. When you say something ought to be, you've just made a moral statement. Specifically, the way it applies in a lot of this is when you say, boy, if it's worth saving one life. No, that's a moral statement. That doesn't have any anything behind it. Mr. Seeklander, you know, your long-term involvement in law enforcement, what sense do you have from your own law enforcement contacts? What are you hearing from them?
Well, I'm actually asking the question on the domestic violences and if they're actually up like we predicted they're up. And the answer across the board has been yes. The answer also across the board is people are edgy and crazier, is the quote I got from another individual. And here's the deal on that. As a former cop, I know for a fact that we're about to enter the summer months. Hey, summer months and the heat starts to crank up, people just get nutty. So if they're already a little bit nutty and they're lower on income, I just think it could potentially be a snowball just starting that ascent down the hill, and we haven't seen it yet. But that, at the same point, though, you know, on the positive side, you know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have predicted, man, we'd be in the middle of some chaos now. I would be hearing my local news channels talk about my local hospital and the respirators ran out, and the shelves would be much more short on supplies, and there'd be like people shooting each other in the streets from domestic violence is, hey, guess what? I just got back from the range. Again, my life is normal when I drive around. If I didn't know this was happening, if you transported me from a different planet, I'd be like, things are as normal as can be, until I drove by a couple of the restaurants and saw the sign. It looks completely normal where I am. So I don't know. I don't know if that means that, hey, maybe we're about to ease into some semblance of normal, assuming that these waves of infections, which we know are going to happen, don't cause some sort of weirdness that we don't know about. But I don't know. I don't know what I don't know right now, which is unique. But I can guarantee every law enforcement contact I've had across the board says, domestics and tempers are flaring, and people are a little crazy right now. They're going stir crazy, especially those that have been stuck in their home. And I do think we're going to see some after effects of the financial stuff. People are going to start running out of money. And speaking of that, we always say you're always on your own. I can speak from personal experience. My company laid me off. My wife got laid off. We've applied for unemployment. We're both on a call list that says, it's a ticket system. You can't get through. I haven't gotten a dime, not a single dime from the federal government or Social Security or unemployment, nothing. So we have been, to an extent, on our own. And I think that's another lesson a lot of people have learned, that if you don't have the ability to, protect your castle and finance it for a few months, you better fix your habits,
Mr. Janich, Dr. Glenn Reynolds, who is a great guy, of course, he hosts the Instapundit blog, which is essentially a compilation of news sources blog, writing in a column in USA Today, said that as we move deeper into the lockdown, it's boiled down to two groups. Group A is getting paid, Group B is not getting paid. And talk a little bit about that. You do see that bifurcation where somebody who's working for the government, for example, or working for a university, or working for, started to say a hospital, but my doctor was just laid off like this week. But there are people getting paid, and at the same time, there are people who are not getting paid, who don't have the government money yet, and that just adds to this kind of boiling pot, this tea kettle function that we're all in.
It definitely does. I mean, again, it comes down to personal situation. When we talk about, assessing kind of where you are in the mix of this entire situation, it's a very individual thing. And for some people, they may not be getting paid, but, they may have prepared and they have the savings to be able to ride this out because they've thought ahead, whether it was something, again, we're all products of, and sometimes victims of, our own experience. If you've been through an experience in life where you've lost a job and then went for several months without employment, that is a life-changing event. So that may have been something that, totally unrelated to what's going on right now, you look back in your history and say, you know what, that really hurt. That was a tough time for me, and I'm never going to let that happen to me again. And if that is something that helped you prepare better for this, then that's great. It's still a difficult situation for you to be in, but you're better prepared because you had a life event that did that. If that never happened to you, if for whatever reason your individual situation was such that you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck and now you're stuck in that difficult situation, again, it's a very individual thing. And that's also what's going to drive, when we come down to risk management again, when you look at it and say, okay, what's the risk of me going back to my job as a bartender or something like that, or me going back to my job where I interface with people at close range on a daily basis, and I know that by doing so, I'm going to increase my vulnerability to getting sick. Well, the more compelling reasons you have, because you don't have the financial resources, you're stretched thinner than maybe somebody else, again, it's going to affect your decisions. And, it's always a very individual, very dynamic thing.
It's interesting. We talked about the different divisions in the country. I recently spoke to some of my relatives in the South. I am from Tennessee, and spoke to some of my relatives, or as we would say, blood kin. We don't say relatives in the South, and asked them how they were doing, and they were almost insulted. Literally, they said, well, Michael, we've still got what we put up from the garden last year, and we still got stuff we put up from the garden last year. And, we had a great deer season, so we've ended up, and it was just because they live in a small town Southern culture that has always rewarded a level of self-sufficiency. And even at times when, it wasn't that they didn't have to worry about being ridiculed for it, because everybody did it. And so when I said, well, you're okay, everything's good, they're like, whoa, why wouldn't we be? Rob, would you suggest to somebody to go to a demonstration to call for the opening of a state, county, municipality?
No, I talked a lot about, I think we might have mentioned it last week. Over the last 10 days, 2 weeks, I've been talking about this idea of responsible rebellion and what that would be and sort of why it might be important. I think as we see government levels, different levels of government responding to people, and, again, to Mike Seeklander's point, we called this a month ago. We said, people are going to start getting restless. People are going to start getting antsy. Thankfully, it hasn't come to riots because we don't have, incredible food shortages over 99% of the surface area of the country. It's not an issue. Over 95% of the surface of the country, we don't have any taxing of our medical system to the point where it's about to break. And generally, there's a lot of people like your kinfolk in Tennessee and my kinfolk, my daughter and son-in-law in Tennessee, doing just fine and making do, but they're annoyed. And they're being, honestly inconvenienced to the point of that brilliant question about what happens in Montana, what happens in New York. So I think that the really important thing to understand here is if you want to rebel, if you want to be civilly disobedient, if you believe that in your area the government is unfairly restricting you from doing something that you can reasonably do without grossly endangering yourself or recklessly endangering others, do that thing. That thing is go to the park with your kids, go to the park with the kids. If that thing is reopen your business in a socially responsible way to keep it afloat, do that. If it's, go back to work and to let your boss know, hey, I know we reduced occupancy and we reduced capacity and you've cut people's hours back, but I got to get some hours. I want to get in on this. One of the other stories that went viral this week is the restaurant owner who says his employees won't come back to work because they're making more from the unemployment or from the stimulus package when they amortize it all together than they were making when they were working. So what's their incentive to come back to work and expose themselves to risk? So when it comes to the demonstrations, you're creating risk. You're creating a distraction for the healthcare workers, obviously, that have been sort of protesting the protesters. You're creating a distraction for law enforcement that has better things to be doing. What you could be doing if you really want to rebel, and again, civil disobedience always involves potential risk of fine, imprisonment, sanction. You're breaking the law. Go open your business, go to the closed park, do it responsibly, be safe. Gathering together, especially without masks, without PPE, that really defeats your purpose, especially at this point. Not only does it potentially make you sick and make others sick, it draws on resources that are important in the community, and it sort of says to everybody, and what I always say to gun owners, if you don't act responsibly with your guns, someone's going to come along and try to legislate their version of responsibility upon us. Lock your guns up so your kids can't get them, or your state's going to end up with rules that say you must lock your gun up. I feel like that's what we're dealing with here. And that's why I say, again, watch Georgia. If people reopen their businesses and they're reckless, to include standing around in a crowd at the state capitol, not wearing masks and high-fiving each other, if you're doing that kind of stuff, don't expect the government to say, yeah, we can trust these people to be more responsible. Now, I get it. It's rights. It's not about trust. They don't have a choice. In practice, they do. And then we fight about it in court. God forbid we end up fighting about it in the street. So let's do the right thing and be responsible in the way we rebel.
My favorite thing this last week was from Montana, where in one county, the county executive, or one of the executives, said it was a good idea that they were going to issue pink armbands to everybody in the county after they've proven they've been in 14 days of self-quarantine. And until they got a pink armband, they couldn't buy food. I have friends in that county. And when they read that, they called the sheriff. And the sheriff said that was basically outhouse rat crazy. And he called the county executive, and 15 minutes later, all of that was removed, and everybody essentially said, oh gosh, we're sorry. Dr. Apel, your thoughts on protest in this time of plague?
Well, I think it's to be expected because people's tolerance for because I said so as a justification for some pretty extreme measures is at an all-time low. If you look at Swedish people in general have a much more favorable attitude toward their government and are willing to believe that their government is being reasonable and looking out for their best interests. Well, that's just kind of not how America rolls, and even less at present. It's one thing to feel like government figures are making it up by the seat of their pants. It's another to actually watch them do it. And then, backed up by some pretty draconian force for some pretty capricious rules is a little hard for people to swallow. I think it does behoove us to be at least a little bit clever. I thought the gridlock protests from some jurisdictions were very well planned because they were respecting the new requirements of social distancing while they protested. So I think, the difference between something like that, which is helpful, and something which isn't, starts to look just like breaking windows to make noise. So I'd like us to be smart while we protest.
Mr. Janich?
As far as the protesting side, one of the interesting things, again, when we look at where people get information, when you look at social media, one of the things that I've seen is some of the people that I know and who I've had good discussions with in the past as far as controversial topics and stuff like that. Some of the things that they're sharing are people who I totally disagree with, but when you listen to them speak, they speak well, even though I don't agree with the content. And they're definitely having their say. And when you talk about something spreading virally, in this case, it's something that, like COVID-19, I don't want it, but it still appears in my social media feed. That type of thing, social media, one of the things we need to understand is that we have the ability to express ourselves, and doing it that way, as opposed to, again, going through the steps of the Capitol, ripping off your mask, French kissing the person next to you and everything else. You don't have to go to that extreme to have your say. So whatever you want to do, if you simply want to make your feelings known, we're better equipped to do that now than at any other time in history. Anyone can have a YouTube channel. Anyone can have a Facebook, account, and you can make your feelings known. But again, you can do that, like Dr. April said, you could do that responsibly, and you could do it in a way that respects other people. And I think that's going to be one of the things as we start to open up. We need to remember that, yes, we want to express our opinions, but we're no more equal than anybody else. And we're no more entitled to our opinion than anyone else. And we're no more entitled to our decisions as far as how we move forward than anyone else. So if the person next to you is wearing a mask and you decide you want to creep up within 3 feet of that person and the person moves back to 6 feet, respect that.
Very good. Very well said. Mr. Sieklander, what would you like to add when we're looking at people who are thinking and protesting the situation, or as we even are opening up?
I don't know if I see, I believe in this, the social level of responsible protesting. I suppose if people feel the need to do that, but honestly, I really can't speak to that because maybe it's the area that I happen to live in. Most of the decisions, I think, have been very logical. Most of the community has followed it, I think, to a T. I don't know about to a T. Like I said, I'm actually impressed so far. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I haven't seen something with my community. I'm impressed with the fact that I can go to Chick-fil-A and nobody touches me and I don't touch anybody at all except for the person that bagged the food, who I know also have gloves and a mask on. I'm just actually very impressed on that. The people in this area have been very respectful. So I really honestly haven't even considered protesting. I haven't heard people talk about it around here. And like I said, that might be just the area of the country that I'm living in. At the same time, I'm also very focused on doing what I do and doing what I'm good at. And I think a lot of people maybe listening to this could consider the same thing. A good buddy of mine at one point in time, I was trying to do a spreadsheet and run some numbers on some financials. I don't remember what I was doing, but I have a person that works with me in an accounting form. And my buddy said, well, why don't you let your accountant do that? I said, I don't want to figure it out myself. He said, why don't you? And his saying has always been, let accountants do what they're good at. Let whatever, tool makers do what they're good at. So do what you're good at. So for me personally, I've just kept doing the things I'm doing. I'm not thinking about protesting. I'm online, which I was anyways, trying to spread information. I'm not posting a bunch of opinion on COVID because everybody's an expert and I'm not. So all I'm posting on and doing is focusing on the things that I am an expert in, trying to bring that in light and help people out. And, hey, what can I do for you? I can do something positive. I can teach you how to draw your handgun. We can discuss handgun carry gear. I can do whatever. There's a variety of things I can talk about. And that's maybe that's my shortcoming, but that's what I've focused on. And it seems to be successful. I think a lot of people need to think about that kind of stuff. Stop trying to make all these decisions. Let the experts do what they're good at. Listen to the information, think objectively, and then go from there.
Well, we're coming up on an hour here. Dr. April, let's bump to you so that you can wrap this up discussion for this week and what we're looking at next week.
Well, I think something important to think about as we're shifting from sort of risk avoidance to risk mitigation, meaning living with the risk going forward, keeping everything on lockdown, especially business, is frankly leaving one of our most generative and productive tools on the shelf. Business people will figure stuff out. If they could just get some clear parameters from the government, they'll figure the rest out. They'll figure out how to serve responsibly, how to be open responsibly, how to conduct business responsibly. But right now, just being told no, and we'll get back to you and tell you when, that's not suitable for most people, especially because it's leaving our potential skill at problem solving on the shelf unused. And I think it's just a waste.
I think that's a very important point, William. I saw that in consulting in companies, is that the people who worked in the companies knew how to fix the problem. They've always known how to fix the problem. You just give them the opportunity to fix the problem.
Yeah, the market itself is a fantastic problem-solving machine. And I think not to recognize that is tremendously wasteful.
Mr. Janich, some final thoughts for the week here?
I think my final thoughts would be kind of to reiterate what we've been recommending all along. As we look at various states opening up, various areas trying to return to normal and everything else, again, what it comes down to is you have to look at your personal situation. I would encourage you to do the research as far as what's going on in your area. As we highlighted, New York City is vastly different than rural Montana, which is different than Las Vegas, which is different than Colorado. You need to look at what the situation is in your area. Look at who you are as an individual, assess your risks, and then behave accordingly. And in the process, also be respectful of other people's decisions to do exactly the same thing. So as you move forward, as you start to ease back into things, just, again, stay aware of what the risks are and stay aware of how they potentially impact you as an individual. And then think also beyond just yourself individually. Think of your loved ones and say, okay, I may be fine, but I have a spouse who has a pre-existing condition, or, I have a child or whatever, somebody else in your inner circle that you might want to say, you know what, for me, I could make this decision, but I'm making a decision also based on the effect that I might have on somebody else that I care about. And think about those kind of extenuating relationships, those extenuating circumstances and everything, and just make decisions that are smart for yourself. Think through it. Don't give into the hype. And again, think for yourself and do what's best for your individual situation.
Mr. Pincus, closing thoughts?
I would just say everything that Janice said is spot on. I think when you're doing what's best for your individual self, that's always the philosophical quandary, right? The categorical imperative, from Kant, is that you need to keep in mind that what is best for you probably is also good for your community members and the rest of society. So it's not a selfish do what's best for you. It's a fully considered do what's best for you. I think that's really important to keep in mind, because there was an article that went around about a year ago, maybe a little more than that I've shared, got a lot of static for sharing it. And I understand why. It offends the patriotism, I guess, aspect, and maybe some nostalgia aspect for all of us. But it's the idea that America is a country. The United States of America is a country but it really is composed of many nations. It's composed of very many different diverse ways of approaching life and cultures and demographics, socioeconomic classes, traditions. And we're seeing that really play out. In addition to the people who are getting paid, people who aren't getting paid issue, there's the people who are super comfortable with the idea of staying locked down as long as we need to, quote unquote, and other people who just want to get this over with, rip the Band-Aid and move forward as two very different mindsets in the country right now. There's a lot of diversity of thoughts, superficial diversity as well. You need to consider that when you're having these discussions with people, when you're reading things, when you're hearing things, when you're watching videos. Just really be careful to consider the vastness of this country and the vastness of social and intellectual diversity as well. This is the time when we're coming out of this. We said a few weeks ago we are heading into the worst of it. We may actually be heading into the worst of it ahead of us, and we don't even know yet. I think we as a society, if we took the pulse right now, most people believe we are heading out of it, at least to some extent. We know there'll be spikes. We know there'll be waves. We know there could be mutations and another bad hit in the fall or next winter, but we have to find the way to move forward. Your way to move forward might be saying, you know what, I'm not ready to go out, and finding someone who is to bring you food and bring you supplies. Your way to go out might be, you know what, I wish this wasn't happening. I'm going to pretend it's not. Don't do that to the point of recklessness for yourself, your family, or the rest of your community.
Very good. Very good. I was going to say I was really looking forward to the hair salons opening so I could get a haircut, and then I looked at this crowd and I realized it's just not that big an issue here. Anyway, thanks again for a great discussion. I wanted to just once again come back, close with a quote. Charles Mackay, the author, wrote a book once called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which is an absolutely fascinating book. And in that book, he talked about a plague in 1630 in Milan, Italy. And I thought it an interesting description of that plague. Everything was believed to be poisoned. The waters of the wells, the standing corn in the fields, and the fruit upon the trees. It was believed that all the objects of touch were poisoned. The walls of the houses, the pavement of the streets, the very handles of the doors. The populace were raised to a pitch of ungovernable fury. An epidemic frenzy was abroad, which seemed to be just about as contagious as the plague. I think we're kind of there, as it were. Again, thanks very much for joining us here. Also, as always, thanks to Mike Seeklander, Michael Janich, Rob Pincus, Dr. William April. I'm Michael Bain. This is The Best Defense Survival, and we will see you next week and every week during the continuation of this COVID-19 emergency. Thank you, and stay safe.